Welcome and thank you for joining the World Affairs Council of Connecticut today to discuss Lafayette Square is Tahrir Square with very special guest, Dr. Stephen Cook, Senior Fellow for Middle East and African Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. My name is Amanda Jolly, VP of Programs at the Council. And before we get started, I just want to outline the format for today's discussion. So today, we're going to kick off a conversation with Dr. Stephen Cook and Megan Torrey, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. By way of brief introduction, Stephen Cook is the Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is an expert on Arab and Turkish politics, as well as US Middle East policy. Stephen is an author, and his most recent work is False Dawn: Protest, Democracy, and Violence in the New Middle East. He is also a columnist at Foreign Policy magazine, and his latest article, which we'll be discussing today, is Yes, Lafayette Square is Tahrir Square. Stephen, we're so glad that you can join us today.
Hey, it's great to be with you. Hello, Connecticut.
It's
nice to be in Connecticut without actually having to get on the train and go to New York and then end up in Connecticut.
You did cut your travel time down.
Yes,
a bit.
Fantastic.
And now let's just get started. I am pleased to turn it over to Megan Torrey, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut.
Thanks, Amanda, and thanks again for everyone joining us from here in Connecticut and from our fellow World Affairs Councils. I know we have councils from New Hampshire and Massachusetts and Philadelphia joining us today, as well as many others.
Then I won't tell them what sports teams I like.
No. But if they're the Red Sox, you can say so.
Definitely not.
As we sit here today, we know that the U.S. is in crisis, not only because of COVID and because of, the economic collapse because of COVID, but we are in the midst of what some equate to a revolution. And Stephen, in your latest article, yes, Lafayette Square is Tahrir Square. Can you set the scene for us? Why are you equating Lafayette Square to Tahrir in 2011?
Yeah, thanks so much, Megan. I really appreciate the invitation. Thanks to Amanda for putting the back end of this all together. And thanks for everybody who's Zooming in or Facebooking in. I'm happy to spend some time talking about this with you all this early afternoon. Look, my intention in writing that piece, yes, Lafayette Square is Tahrir Square, was not to suggest that what was happening in the United States was a revolution, or even to suggest, if you read my book, False Dawn, to suggest what had happened in the Middle East in 2010 and 2011 were a series of revolutions. What it was I think there was a lot of loose talk about revolution. I think there was a lot of loose talk on Twitter about, scenes unfolding in DC or Minneapolis or Chicago or New York or other parts of the country that, looked like what had happened in the Middle East. And I think that those comparisons were quite facile, but there was a central thread to me that ran through the demands that people were making in the now famous squares of the Middle East, as well as Taksim Square in Turkey, in Istanbul. I was a witness to the Egyptian uprising in January 2011. Although I wasn't there for the entire 18 days. And I was also a witness to the Gezi Park protests in the summer of 2013. And so I was responding to the things that I heard both in Tahrir Square and in Taksim Square, and listening to what people were saying about protesting in Minneapolis and all these places around the country. And what struck me was a real commonality there, that there was outrage over police brutality. There was an outrage over the arrogance of power of leaders. There was outrage over economic systems that weren't working. And then when you drilled right down to it, and you focus on the real issue at hand in the demonstrations around the United States about the treatment of African Americans. And I'm not even just going to confine it to treatment of African Americans when it comes to their interaction with law enforcement, but broadly speaking, what is Black Lives Matter if not a demand for dignity for African Americans? If you take all of the things that people were saying to me in Tahrir Square or Gezi Park now almost a decade ago, all the kind of economic, social, political demands that they were making were also taking together demands for dignity. And that's really the central thread that I see in my equating Lafayette Square to Tahrir Square.
So you just talked about being there, right? Being in Cairo, being in Istanbul in the midst of this. What did you feel when you saw what was happening, in June 1st in Washington?
Well, it was frightening. I remember seeing the Central Security Forces in Cairo show up and actually be reinforced around Tahrir Square on the night of January 25th, 2011, the early morning of 2006. And I remember seeing these trucks show up and these young guys being, deployed on the streets, and then there being these like massive charges into protesters. And just full on beatings and tear gas and so on and so forth. So really, it was quite scary because I was standing there on the street watching this happen before me, and I was quite scared that people were going to die. This in Gezi Park, I positioned myself along what's called Istiklal Caddesi, basically Independence Street in Istanbul, and was chased by the Turkish riot police and sucked a lot of tear gas that night too. That was also quite scary. I remember I was actually taken in by the owners of a small cafe with a number of protesters. I mean, I was there recording what was happening. I was actually in Turkey at that time doing book research and got kind of caught up with this. And then we were like welcomed into this small little cafe, turned the lights off, shielding us from the riot police. And these are what I saw in the news footage of what was happening around the United States. It was evocative of these things. There was a real fear that people were going to get terribly hurt. People were terribly hurt. I suspect that for me in Egypt in 2011, it was more awe-inspiring, just because, having studied that part of the world, and up until that point, the general consensus among people like me was that political stability was the dominant trend in the region. And all of a sudden, people were taking matters into their own hands to demand change. That was something that was, on the face of it, on the surface, quite unusual. Of course, Egyptians have been in revolt against the people who've been ruling them for, the better part of the last 150 years. But that kind of eruption we had not seen in Egypt. There was 1977, 1986, 1968, 1972. These are something that my generation of Middle East analysts had not really seen much of. The United States, look, we've seen protests before. This is a constitutional right. The police brutality was shocking in ways. The looting was shocking, but in general, this is something that people have a constitutional right to do in the United States. So it wasn't as kind of awe-inspiring. People really in Egypt and Turkey were putting themselves out and in a way, at least in theory, that we have that right. They don't have those rights.
So when we're looking at the reasons behind the protests, what parallels can we draw between what is happening here in the U.S. in sort of demands for seismic change around racial issues here in the U.S. and what was happening in Turkey, what was happening in Cairo? Right.
Well, I think, look, just as the top line here, what I want to start with what is not the same. And in Egypt, the one of the famous sayings that you heard in chants, you heard in Tahrir Square from the very moment people arrived there to demonstrate was the people demand the end of the regime. That's not really, it doesn't strike me that's what people in the United States want. They don't want to overthrow the political system and the prevailing social order. They would like restructuring. They would like change. They would like restructuring of law enforcement. They would like a repair of the social safety net that has been so undermined over the course of 40 years or more. There was, though, particularly in the uprisings in the Arab world, there was this demand for change in the regime and a desire for revolution. Those didn't come to pass, of course. But again, to me, the real similarity here is these collective calls for dignity among people, and that you have a complex set of social, economic, and political demands that come together. They're hard to disassemble and pull apart, and that what they essentially amount to is a demand for greater dignity. And given this fact that these protests in the United States are centered on the experiences of African Americans, it's hard. There's a lot has been said about Black Lives Matter, but at its core is a demand for dignity. And it's the same kind of core demand for dignity that people in whether it was Cairo, Istanbul, Benghazi, Sidi Bouzid, Manama, Daraa, all of these different places around the region. That's what they were demanding.
So in your book, False Dawn, you explore why the Arab Spring uprisings ultimately failed to deliver on the revolutions that they promised. Can you describe some of those main factors and what led to that?
Yeah, in the book, I argue, three related issues. One contributed to this false dawn, and let me say, because I've been criticized unfairly, I think, and sometimes criticism is fair, but other times criticism is unfair. Is to say that I've been criticized unfairly in the reading of False Dawn, the title in and of itself, as suggesting that people in the Arab world are unable to, whether they're culturally unsuited or for other reasons, cannot forge a path to a more democratic, more open, more just societies. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the events as they unfolded in 2010 through 2013 amounted to what is essentially a false dawn. And for these three related reasons. One, the uprisings were not actually revolutions. They overthrew leaders, but they didn't necessarily overthrow the reinforcing social order. And what I mean by that is, let's just take Egypt, because it's the kind of paradigmatic example of what happened. Hosni Mubarak was overthrown, so there was a leadership change, but the political system itself did not change. And after a relatively brief interregnum, Hosni Mubarak, who had been an Air Force commander, the country is once again in the hands of a military commander. Before Hosni Mubarak, there was Anwar Sadat, who was a military officer. Before him was Gamal Abdel Nasser. These are political system. The political system in Egypt was something that was founded by military officers and has come to reflect their interests. And even though after Mubarak fell, the military said that the armed forces and the people are one hand, there was never any question that the military was going to do everything possible to salvage the political system. So that's one problem. Two, because there was no revolution, the prevailing political institutions of the previous order remained. They may have been weakened, but they remained. Very, very hard to change institutions from within. That doesn't necessarily mean that revolution is necessary for democratic change, but in this case, the fact that the institutions of the state remain largely intact put those who want a democratic and open future at a tremendous disadvantage. And then finally, there was, and this is related in a different way, is essentially after these uprisings, Egyptians, Syrians, Libyans couldn't agree on what it meant to be Egyptian, Syrian, Libyan, Bahraini, or whatever, name your uprising around the region. Even in Tunisia, the successful case, there is still this question about what it means to be Tunisian. And that is actually, in an interesting way, directly related to the institutions of the state, how they were set up and how they reflect the power of certain people. So, for instance, Tunisia was founded by a lawyer named Habib Bourguiba, who was educated in France and had these ideas about secularism and so on and so forth. The institutions of the Tunisian state reflect those ideas in the people around Bourguiba who assumed power. There is still a debate going on. Now, in Tunisia, it didn't manifest itself in violence, but you broke open the system and it became contested. You break open the system in Egypt, and it becomes even more contested than it was before.
So I'm going to bring in an audience question. So what lessons can leaders of the Black Lives Movement take from the Arab Spring in order to sort of avoid some of the same disappointment and ensure real change happens?
It's a really interesting question. And I was talking to a very, very close friend of mine this weekend who threw caution to the wind and has been protesting in New York and actually drove down to Washington to be part of the big protest on Saturday. And what we were talking about was the loss of momentum. And, by the time Hosni Mubarak fell in February 2011, I was safely back in Washington, D.C. in my little bubble and, kind of watching this real time. I said to, the three people standing around me, I certainly hope that the people who've been demonstrating for the last 18 days don't leave Tahrir Square, because they should put no trust in the military to make any changes unless under duress. And I think the same thing is at play here, obviously in a different context, in a different setting, but that what has forced municipalities in this country to suddenly, police reform was broadly on the agenda, but you have city councils who are taking action. You have, the Democratic leadership writing major police reform bills, forcing Republicans to offer their own police reform bill. This is happening because large numbers of people have taken to the streets. So it is, I'm not calling for permanent protests, but you have to keep the pressure on. And one of the things that, if you want to see real change, and one of the things that I think that has led to the kinds of change that we're already seeing in the United States is that allies of the Black Lives Matter movement, people who've come out to protest, have not said, okay, it's done, we've made our point, and go back to all the other things. That this seems to be something that's defining. But there is going to be a question: how do you move from the street to kind of activism that continues to put pressure on our elected leaders to do things that are going to be hard for them to do?
Absolutely. So I have a question from the audience that sort of asks you about the manifestation of what's happening in the US in the Middle East. So we know that we've seen protests around the world, right, in over 30 countries. And so this questioner asks, we are now seeing George Floyd graffiti appear all over the Middle East, in Syria, in Palestine, in Egypt, and other countries. And I understand the protesters, the number of protesters in the Middle East are fewer than in the rest of the world. But we understand why, because of, their people are not allowed to protest. But the hashtag, BLM is trending all over the Middle East. How do you see this, and why is this movement being accepted or promoted in the Middle East like that?
For precisely the reason that I wrote the column. Yes, Lafayette Square is Tahrir Square. There is, I think, people have intuited that this is at a basic level a similar call for dignity that swept through major parts of the Middle East a decade ago, and that I have continued up until the pandemic. Huge protests in Lebanon this past fall. Iraq, huge protests broke out in October, and there were protests even before that. But I think people understand that there is this commonality that runs through it. Of course, some of it also is just trolling. I mean, Americans show up in the Middle East and say, we're exceptional, arrange your lives, arrange your politics the way we do it. And there's trolling. Then there's also disappointment. I've been going back and forth now to the Middle East, including long periods of living in places like Egypt or Turkey or Syria or Ramallah in the Palestinian areas now since 1992. And what people have, I'm not old, people have often said to me that they were outraged by America's conduct in the world, but had tremendous respect for the institutions, ideals, and principles by which we lived here in the United States, or at least that we sought to live by, that we wanted to live by. You hear less of that these days. a lot less of that these days because of things that are happening, that have happened in the United States over the course, arguably, of the last 2 decades. So there is a sense that the United States has lost its way. And that is I think a profoundly shocking and profoundly disappointing. I got a message from a friend in Egypt today after the president's tweet about this gentleman in Buffalo who was pushed by the police department. And he said, isn't this reminiscent? He is Thawar, a revolutionary. He said, isn't this reminiscent of the way in which those opposed to the January 25th uprising tried to delegitimize people like me?
Wow. Let's stick with how the U.S. is perceived in the region and around the world. So how would you sort of describe how the U.S. was being perceived in the Middle East before this crisis happened? And how is the U.S. being perceived now? And what are the implications for American power and American leadership in the world?
Well, which crisis? The coronavirus pandemic
Yeah,
or our social unrest? And I think they're related. I actually think that they are related. But I think I flew about 50,000 miles between November and when everything was shut down. So including 2 trips to the Gulf. I think 2 trips to the Gulf and a trip to Iraq. And the sense, even before this, is the profound sense of American incompetence. That here we are, this wealthy country, we put a man on the moon, we've done all kinds of amazing things, and the United States is proven itself to be incompetent. I mean, they warned us that Iraq was not going to be a cakewalk, but they're looking into the United States and they're seeing things. And so, everything from Hurricane Katrina to Superstorm Sandy to, everything in between, in addition to our inability to kind of get ourselves together on the world stage. I think one of the things that, and this is obviously not an original thought to me, but something that I have articulated to my friends in the region, whether it's, just friends or government officials, is that deeply divided societies, polarized societies, have a very hard time getting things done because everything is contested, right? This is not a political statement. This is an observation. Healthcare, in light of a pandemic that has infected lots of people and killed lots of people in this country, has become political. That is reflective of a society that can't get anything done. And that's feeding itself into a view in the Middle East that, hey, the United States is incompetent. We can't rely on the United States like we used to before, whether it's for the aid that we want or for the protection that we seek or to lead us in this or to provide examples of a democratic, just society.
So we're almost running out of time, but I want to ask you one last question. Is there anything the U.S. can do to reestablish credibility as a global leader?
Well, I'm tempted to say we have to get our house in order first, and I think that is the case. I think if you have if our social ills are playing themselves out on the world stage, there's a lot of questions that people have about being partners with the United States. I also think part of that also in getting our house in order is that we're not so polarized. So, if you're sitting in the Middle East and you have one administration that approaches a whole set of issues in one way, and then another, and then everything is so polarized, and for basically political reasons, to turn 180. I mean, I'm not apologizing for us, having peaceful changes in government, but there is this sense that there's a lack of consistency in America's approach to the problems of the region, and that it's driven by our polarized politics, not by any kind of, objective assessment of what America's interests are and what the issues are in the region.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stephen. What I want to do right now is do something a little bit different than we normally do. I want to bring in one of our board members, Esam. And so many of you know that Esam, who sits on our board of directors, was a leader of the Egyptian revolution. He was imprisoned in Egypt, and he is now living here in Connecticut. And we are lucky to have him. Esam, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Hello.
Yes, how are you? I wanted to just ask you, you know, having just heard Stephen and you know, living here in the U.S. during this time, what are you feeling and what do you have to say to our audience today?
Hello. I just would like to thank Stephen for a beautiful piece he wrote. It's beautiful that I
Very nice of you to say.
to read it. First, echo what Stephen just said about keeping the pressure and understand it's a continuous process. It's not an event we will participate at or attend and then leave and everything will be fine after this. No, we really have to keep the pressure on and keep pushing for all the agenda we're hoping to see on the ground. And the one thing I would disagree with Stephen with is basically it's like what I see as a harsh judgment of a failure in the Arab Spring movement, and I do believe a misplaced judgment based on the effort we see in the street every day. Yes, it's not as famous or as out there as it used to be after the Egyptian revolution, but it's still the underground organizing efforts and efforts to keep pushing for the Arab Spring uprisings and the Egyptian revolution's agenda is still strong, and the motive going as strong as it used to be. Yes, the challenges are very high, and people go to prison every day for their efforts and what they're doing. And I'm sure Stephen is familiar with many attempts to reorganize groups and keep pushing for origin and to keep the pressure on the street. But this is what I really wanted to say. Really, it's as Stephen said, it's a continuous process. We need to keep the pressure, and that's exactly what this amazing revolutionary generation in Egypt and the Middle East is doing right now. And hopefully they will have the stamina and resources to keep going before they give up.
So Esam, thank you for joining us. Stephen, I hope that you are able to make the train trip up here to Connecticut at some point in the future.
Inshallah, as they say in the Middle East, I would love to. Believe me, having been locked in, not really locked in, but having really been in these four walls for about 3 months now, I'll take the trip to Connecticut. So let me just thank you all very much. Esam, thank you very much for your comments. I appreciate them. Megan, thank you again for the kind invitation. This has been a lot of fun. The questions were terrific, and I'd be happy to do it again either over Zoom or live.
Fantastic. Thank you all and stay well. Over to you, Amanda.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all, everyone. Before I let everyone go, I want to put in a quick plug for next week and for continued engagement. So next week on June 17th, we'll have another episode. It's going to be on coronavirus in Israel, and it's going to be a special partnership with the Consulate General of Israel to New England. So we'll be hosting Dr. and Professor Fahad Akim, Medical Director of the Nazareth Hospital, which is the largest medical facility in the Arab sector of Israel, to discuss the impact of the pandemic in Israel and how this may be impacting the future of relations within the country. So we hope that you can join us. You can find more information on the ctwac.org website. And I also want to put one more plug in to follow us on YouTube. You can subscribe at the World Affairs Council of Connecticut YouTube channel to make sure that you get a notification about this episode and all future episodes to come, because it was fantastic. Thank you to Megan, Stephen, Esam. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we will see you next week.
Take care, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.